everyone else. I think the way I would like to start our conversation today is to just frame a little bit about why are we here? Why do we bring this group together? So one thing that I've always thought of and heard about when, like, over the past, thanks Nate, 15 years working in education, is probably a little bit more than that. But in the last 15 years working in education, I have seen that school districts and, charters, networks, schools are very unique, but they also have lots of commonalities. And I think that there is opportunity for groups to come together and talk about those differences and commonalities in order to be able to elevate problems of practice and then work together to really define ways in which we can address those problems of practice. So this very thing is what we wanted to talk about. We brought the experts. We thought about and took a look at the work that you all are doing, trying to think about resilience and equity, and thought, who are the best folks to bring to the table, which is why we brought this group together. We don't think that this group of experts, they're not going to have the absolute solution or answer about what it is you're trying to get to, but they will be great thought partners who are able to leverage the work that they're doing across the country to sort of say, hey, have you thought about this? Hey, you might consider this because I have seen X, Y, and Z. So let's just assume that every answer isn't going to be perfect, but we hope that it gets you on a path to thinking about what is the right solution for me in Cedar Rapids or in Monterey or in Boston, in the state of Massachusetts. This is designed here to help you think about what's possible and then how do I start moving towards the design piece. So I will stop talking. I would like to hand over to one of my colleagues with two things. We asked the groups coming to this, or the experts coming to this, to think about, to pull together an image. And we wanted them to pull together the image that said, think of a district that you have worked with that has aspired to be more equitable, resilient, and what does that look like? What is the image that you have presented of that? And as you go and present that, I would love for you to hear from your discussions that you just had, what are some examples or glimpses from the small group discussions that you had that tell you, hey, here's something that, here's how this district, or here's how this picture that I have pulled is starting to, I heard glimmers of that from you all in my small group discussion. So would love to hear examples of what's the forward-looking view, and then what did I hear that tells me, hey, keep at it, keep working. So I'm going to start out with you, Sarah Johnson, and ask you to share your picture.
Great, no problem. Don't mind going first at all. Thank you, Gwen, and thanks for the wonderful introduction, and thank you everybody for welcoming me into your group. So I'm going to share the before and after picture. So I live in New York City right now. We're actually upstate for a second. I'm taking a break for the first time in a really long time, and it's not even a long break. But since the pandemic, we have just been working in overdrive at Teaching Lab because we are a teacher professional learning organization. And when COVID hit in March, we started supporting our over 30 school systems and the over 4,000 educators in our partnerships. We started serving them with high impact virtual professional learning. And we started focusing our professional learning on supporting them in adapting to these remote and hybrid learning contexts. And I would say that thankfully, the demand for our work has gone through the roof. And I say thankfully, not for our sake, but for the districts and teachers' sake, because I wasn't sure if districts were going to invest in the time and money required to upskill teachers for this new era. But we have actually seen that they are, which is incredibly heartening and important. So anyways, my image, which I'll share, let me just share my screen. Okay, I say I'm from New York because my image is about New York. And the district that I want to talk about is District 11 in the Bronx. So let me just turn on the slideshow. Okay, so New York City is getting a bad rap right now. And this is what's going on. So they delayed the start of school for 10 days. They severely underestimated the amount of staff they would need to reopen in a combination of remote and hybrid and in-person contexts. There have been huge fights with the mayor and the union and the chancellor. And I used to work for the school system, and I actually think this is a tragedy. However, we have an amazing partnership in place with a district in the Northeast Bronx called District 11. It serves over 80% Black and Latinx students. 10% of the students are experiencing low income. And the work of the superintendent has been incredible. So again, since March, she has been convening parents. So these are the three main things she did. She's convened and mobilized parents, and she's done it continuously. And you can see this tweet where they said this was like in early September that 400 parents joined their town hall to discuss reopening. And now what they've been doing is they have weekly meetings that are open to all of the parents in District 11. So I looked at the materials for this panel, and I saw like these phrases like co-design used and whatnot. Practitioners, they don't have time to like create fancy frameworks and whatnot, but they engaged in co-design with parents, right? I think this is an exceptional example of co-design, and they continue to co-design reopening plans in District 11. Additionally, they worked with teachers and invested in their professional learning, and they've been doing that since the summer. And now their teachers are ready to go on remote and hybrid instruction. And then finally, they had centered racial equity and everything they were doing before, and they haven't stopped. So you can also see on their Twitter page that they're still convening teachers around their anti-racism efforts. They're still putting this at the center of every academic goal that they have for students and for schools. And so I think this is a huge success story within a really difficult context, and those are my images. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah. I think I will hand it over to Sujata.
Thank you. Apologies that I didn't actually create the images, but I think I can share something. What I really appreciated was when Suzanne from Austin was talking about the tensions that a central office faces when you're thinking about creating space for innovation. And at the same time, you're trying to think about how coherence operates, both in service of efficiencies, but even more importantly, in service of equity, that strong tension between autonomies, innovation, flexibilities on the one hand, and how do you design guardrails that enable yet a kind of system level coherence. So if I were to share a picture, it probably would have been like the Roman Empire, which is a massive and dispersed thing that in various phases has been violent and has been hated, and in other phases has been loved. But one of its major things that it did was build the pipes, right? The roads that connected, the currency that let interoperability across very different cultures happen. And the district that I have in mind as inspiration is a district in North Carolina called Rowan-Salisbury Schools. It's a district of about 20,000. And they just last week were lucky enough to get a teacher and school leader grant from the USDOE for $26.3 million that lets them move their work forward exponentially, hopefully. But they're very forward-thinking, led by a forward-thinking superintendent, Lynn Moody, who unfortunately has just decided that she's retiring at the end of this year, or at the end of this calendar year, but nevertheless has built a strong team and is always thinking with learners in mind. They managed to get themselves defined as the only kind of renewal district, which is kind of North Carolina's term for innovation in some ways. But so they have charter-like autonomies as a district, not for like I was in LA Unified, I was in Boston Public Schools. So there were pilot schools that had charter-like autonomies, but not the entire district, which created its own tensions of how innovation can live within a system that is still required to be kind of reporting in very specific ways. But so this entire district has autonomies, and they've been thinking very carefully about what redesign could look like. COVID hit. And of course, George Floyd's murder and all of the equity conversations that came up in light of that. And so Rowan-Salisbury is, and also North Carolina has a large percentage of people moving into homeschooling. So they have micro schools like everyone does, learning pods, a large homeschooling movement. This district took advantage of the great education experiment that we are all embarked upon, whether we wanted to or not, kind of the greatest education experiment in human history, uniformly across the globe. And they said, let's really think about what is best for kids, each individual kid. What could a future look like that is not about brick and mortar, but that is also not about a district as the central controller of a student's journey? So how might we think about an education ecosystem that serves our community, that allows kids to create their own pathway to where they want to go? So they're having conversations with independent schools, they're having conversations with charter schools, they're having conversations with micro schools and homeschoolers and everyone. And what they are now going to be embarking on over the next 3 years is really, how do you architect an ecosystem where the district is like Rome in its best days? What are kind of the minimum structural pipes, roads, infrastructures that are needed to create interoperability so that learning happens anywhere it does happen, but it can get credentialed into the system or validated in some form in the system and be legible when students leave. When I say system, I actually mean ecosystem, the PK-12 learning ecosystem, into whether it's college, work, or the military. So that the burden of coherence is the burden that the district is taking on, but viewing it as an infrastructure opportunity versus something competitive. And they're wanting to make sure that this makes it easy for kids to leave the ecosystem and have maximum interface with the opportunities that they want to succeed in life and change and impact their communities.
Thank you. I'm like trying to think about who could best pick up on that. And I will hand it over to you, Virgil, to share your image and to talk about the work.
Great. And I do love that analogy, Sujata. That's really great. And coherence, absolutely. How do you create that coherence and that alignment? And we heard that from our learning communities in our breakout session in Austin. I know you're tackling that now as well. And we actually at KnowledgeWorks, just really quickly, we serve communities across the country in a number of different ways. We have a focus on policy practice and also future foresight. And through the pandemic, we've, much like what you've heard from others, and especially Sarah, it was a good opportunity to reconnect with our learning communities and our state communities to say, geez, how might we be of service, or what are the big pieces that you're currently tackling, and what are things that you're considering might be your new Rome. And this visual actually was just, we just put this together about a week ago to synthesize what our learning communities were tackling. So this is kind of a compilation of the core themes, the meta themes, and the conditions that they're currently working through. And so some of the kind of those meta themes are the blue through lines that transcend all of the rainbowed elements. Are a deep focus on, much like what we heard in the breakout sessions, is how do we establish this culture that helps us to rethink what is possible and what we can do in service of our kids and our communities, and how might we do that in the absolute most transparent way possible. So with that transparency, just to try to kind of capture that, was this idea of Transparency not just being we're putting it out there for others to see it, but how do we include people in the design process, right? So our adults in our communities, but also our youth. And then how do we do that with that equity mindset, right? Recognizing that our current structures might be grounded in some really oppressive and racist ideologies. And so the core conditions that are also we've heard from you all here today is, what does our curriculum mean? How do we create that coherence around our curriculum so that we can go deeper with our learning? How might we inspire learner agency to help drive kind of this redesign? And by learner, just what came out of our community conversations is that learner is the recognition that it's not just our young learners, but our adult learners as well, as we heard from Sarah and Sujata as well, right? It's as adults, for many of us who have been in the system for a year or multiple decades, we recognize that this is a whole new learning structure for us. So how do we inspire the voices of our young and adult learners? And how do we create the space for flexibility in how we're learning and how we're developing these new skill sets, again, as young and adult learners? And naturally, of course, recognizing that we're all kind of going through these structures together. So how do we acknowledge those social emotional skills while also developing those skills to be successful and to be able to thrive in any learning environment? And then there were some other key questions that kind of came up. Nate, if you don't mind fast forwarding to the next visual. These were kind of the key focus areas that our learning communities identified as either urgent in the red or blue. We're also thinking through these things. I think just that big first column there is, holy smokes, you know what's come to the light here through this pandemic is, geez, we have exacerbated perhaps some systems that have created this oppression to exist unintentionally, or this has clearly come to light through this pandemic. So how do we recognize that? And how do we shift our thinking to say, how might we learn from that and address those and shift those or eradicate those entirely? And then also thinking about, and we heard this in the breakout sessions as well, and I applaud the 3 learning communities that were with us, and thinking about, geez, what are those measures of success, right? What is it that we're holding ourselves and our kids accountable to? What is it that we want them to learn? So being very explicit about those things. So in what we're hearing in many of our learning communities, I'll give one example. Kenowa Hills, Michigan is essentially saying, this is our time to finally deploy those competencies that we've been designing for some time and been afraid to do, right? Here's the opportunity for us to say, this is what we're going to hold ourselves and our kids accountable to learning, and also give them the opportunity to demonstrate that learning in ways that are inspiring and meaningful to them. But here's the really interesting part, and you'll see this reflected in the other blue and red boxes as well. How might we create the conditions for our kids to advocate for their own learning of these particular competencies so that not only it serves them in their learning, but perhaps serves their community as well. Their community, much like the rest of our country and world, is going through some significant transitions. And so here is an opportunity to address those transitions that are happening in community through the learning, their new learning infrastructure as well. And one key piece, I'll just share this because I know I'm at time, is how do you inspire that agency to exist? That became a question for them is, well, geez, we haven't really done that with our kids. Like the whole idea of giving voice to our kids, we don't just give it to them and they expect them to run with it, right? It's not something that is a part of our culture just yet. And so what they started to do in their remote and now hybrid environments is to essentially give kids small opportunities to help find their own voice, give them some ownership of the learning process and learning structure, have them co-design that, whether it's in the classroom or via Zoom. And that has trickled up or created momentum for them, for their kids to recognize that they can do that, not just in how the learning ecosystem functions, but how they might demonstrate their learning as well. And so it started with these kind of gradual small steps of giving them that voice, to now kids are advocating for different ways to demonstrate their learning. Again, because they were able to release those competencies, kids were able to identify what mastery looks like, and in turn, they can leverage those opportunities on their own. Glad to be with you, and just want to, while I have the time, just want to say kudos to just hearing your stories, reading your bios and your work. It's just amazing. So thank you for putting our kids first as a parent and as a former principal and superintendent, and just so amazed by the work that you all are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Virgil. Jason, love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. Yes, good afternoon. So my name is Jason Green. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of an organization called LINC. LINC stands for Learning Innovation Catalyst. I'm also the co-author of a book called Blended Learning in Action. What's interesting about us is we wrote that book back in 2016. And as you can imagine, the relevance of it is even more now than it was when we wrote it, now going on almost 5 years ago. And just by way of a little bit more background, what LINC has really tried to do is support a word that's come up a few times today, the mindset shifting of educators toward a much more student-centered approach to learning into classrooms. What we've also tried to do is really think about the connection between blended learning, personalization, and equity. So that's a little bit about myself and the work that we've been up to. I'm going to actually share my screen to talk about the district that I want to share about, which is Hartford Public Schools. Hartford Public Schools, as many of you might know, is led by Dr. Leslie Torres Rodriguez. And they had we've been working with Hartford Public Schools since around March of 2020, so really in response to COVID. The reason why I wanted to bring Hartford to the forefront here is the superintendent has made a very intentional effort around a couple of things. Virgil just mentioned transparency. What you're seeing on this chart right here is back in March, which was like kind of right when COVID was hitting, as you all know, Hartford was experiencing less than 50% engagement in Google Classrooms, which essentially meant for them that less than half of their kids were even coming to school during that time. When you talk about transparency, what they knew was they had to, with a whole lot of honesty and humility, acknowledge that this wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to work for their students, for their families, or quite honestly, for their teachers. When we began working with Hartford, from really acknowledging this data, they made a committed effort to do a couple of things. One, provide professional learning to teachers that was actually able to meet teachers where they were. As all of you know, you're in obviously very progressive school systems. Teachers need all kinds of different support. So getting a workshop to everybody is not going to be the thing that moves the needle. So what they began to acknowledge was they had to really think differently about differentiating PD in a way that actually met teachers where they were. For some teachers, we literally helped them like, here's how to scroll your screen. For other teachers, they were ready to think about differentiating their Google Classrooms and doing flipped learning and things like this. So what we began to do was really work with Hartford around a model for differentiation of PD. What they also did was make a commitment to really creating a culture of learning and a culture of equity. And by starting with the teachers, that actually began to kind of funnel down as well to the students. So in essence, really kind of modeling in teacher PD what they were hoping to create with their students. So in a very short period of time, Hartford was able to boost their engagement during COVID by almost double, which obviously from an equity standpoint made a huge impact on how all their students were experiencing learning in the district. They made a huge commitment to getting technology to be more accessible. And they were able to actually have incredible gains in a very short period of time. So I really call out Hartford and during this this time of COVID for what they did then, but even what they have continued to do. So now answering the question of what do we see moving forward? So to answer that question, I want to share a framework that we've actually introduced in our book, but now incorporate into our work with LINC, and that is a way to really think about personalization such that it becomes more real for teachers. And what's interesting is what we found is the word personalization gets thrown around all over the place, but it's very rarely condensed into how do I as a teacher think about my classroom to make this real. So we use a framework that we call the PAC in personalization, and that stands for agency, authenticity, connectivity, and creativity. And what we found is the teachers that are really stepping into this kind of, I don't even want to say a new way of thinking, but during this time where every classroom is having to deal with remote, hybrid, maybe blended, or all these different things, the teachers that are actually leaning into this framework of personalization are actually finding that students are able to get something that was different, in some cases, dare I say, better than even what some traditional classrooms were able to give to students, because now you're meeting them in a different place that's more unique to that student's need. One of the things I shared in the earlier group was, I'll just talk about connectivity for a second. We're finding that the school systems that are putting connection before content are having much better success in having students actually meet their learning goals, because there's such a need right now for people to just have real human connection. And so when we think about blended learning, it's actually not from the standpoint of, hey, more tech, more tech, more tech. It's actually from the standpoint of how can we use tech to create deeper connections. And so that's part of what we see moving forward. And the last thing that I'll share is, I mentioned earlier that we make this very intentional connection between blended learning, personalization, and ultimately equity. And in 1 minute, the reason why we kind of use this almost 3-step is because when we think about blended learning, it's really mostly about creating classrooms that work for different modes of learning for different students, right? We know that most students need different kinds of experiences to really engage deeply in learning. All blended learning does is it creates different modalities in a classroom. What it also does, though, is it frees the teacher from lecturing to spend more time with students in different ways. And that's how you create personalization. It's the teacher getting to know the students better. And when a teacher is able to get to know their students better, giving them more agency, more voice, that's when we believe you have a chance to create real equity. Because now as a teacher, I know you. And so for us, this kind of connection between the need for blended practices to create more personalization and ultimately equitable classrooms is really something that we see as the next step, and what we're hopeful for, that many districts really take this opportunity of literally reimagining classrooms to create more equity for all their students. Thank you so much. And again, I just really acknowledge all those that are on this journey. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jason. And last but certainly not least, Malika.
Hi, everyone. It's been great to hear everyone so far. And as I shared 2 slides, you know, some of the things that really stuck out to me from the conversations in our breakout room were around there were districts were talking about how they're trying to get, or they have, like, high quality curricular materials. And, you know, some have challenges around buying around it. Some of it, you know, maybe they are bought in, and we're trying to implement this curriculum with fidelity, right, or with integrity. And some of what we hear a lot about from districts that we're working with is that it isn't always meeting the needs of a lot of our students. And I'll actually make this full screen so that folks can see it a little bit better. And so you have this high quality curricular material, but, you know, a lot of what we've been hearing is, you know, there are groups of students for whom it's not working. So if you think of it like a mountain, right? Not all of the kids are up there achieving their grade level, you know, standards, you know, which is sort of this flag at the top. And so they're not sure what to do. So one, they're recognizing that for a lot of students who have disabilities, they're not having adequate access. For a lot of students who are multilingual learners, they're having challenges with accessing the curriculum as well. And then there are students who have been really disengaged by the schooling experience because of systemic inequity, because of the ways in which the system has and continues to fail them. And so, as we think about integrating high quality curricular material and supporting students, from these groups, and all students to be able to make it up the mountain, whether it is through, supporting our special educators to be able to adequately differentiate to get, these different pathways up the mountain. Maybe the maps look different for students to be able to read it to get up there, right? And then, of course, for our multilingual learners, that's sort of the same kind of considerations around how do we support students to be able to access this same curriculum. And then we have a shift in a lot of our schools and districts that we're hearing from, who are saying, okay, we recognize that just having this high quality curriculum material is not enough, right? We need to not only think about the ways in which we engage students, particularly those who have been marginalized by systemic inequity, and who've been sort of conditioned to be dependent learners and to be compliant, and really, are not carrying the cognitive load. And that was something I heard in our breakout rooms. How do we support those students? So there's this pedagogical approach that has to shift and change in order for there to be adequate access, actual access to, HQCM. And so I think of it sometimes as, like, say you're laying, the dinner table. Not everyone can eat at the table, right? Until you pull up the chairs and invite students in ways that they can actually get access to the food and eat it. Laying the table is not enough. And so a lot of our districts are experiencing these challenges around, okay, how do I support all of my students, every single one of my students, to be able to make it up the mountain? And how do I support my teachers to understand how to do this work? That was something I heard also from our breakout room. And then secondarily, how do I manage change so that we can sort of scale and sustain these efforts across time? And so we think of these things sort of as these two axes. There's sort of the pedagogical piece, and there's the change management model. And maximizing impact means addressing both of these things. It means using a culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogical framework, coupled with a community-driven approach to change management. So we convene sort of design teams that are made up of teachers and students and coaches and school and district admin and community members and families, and they go through this design effort. And so we'll talk about it a little bit later in this panel, but the idea is that by doing these two things together, we can not only support students to be critical thinkers, to be self-directed learners, to actually be leaders of change in their own lives, for their communities, and ultimately society, but also for the school and the district to be able to sustain and scale change by having it be owned by the community that's actually driving the change. In other words, there's a question always of whose change is it? And so when you can get that sort of not just buy-in, but ownership, then you can sort of produce things that come from it. So one of the really cool things that happened as we sort of shifted into this sort of COVID moment in the spring was that these design teams came together and they had to figure out, how do we support, our teachers and our students and our families? How do we support the school in shifting? And this was something that none of us had really experienced before. And so they came together, and at one of the schools, they were thinking about, okay, let's lean on our continuous improvement model that we've been working on in our design team. And so they did sort of a bright spots analysis / kind of after action review to see, okay, what's happening? How are families experiencing this? How are students experiencing this? And then did empathy interviews with people, especially those who are sort of the outliers. At another school, it was, okay, let's rally around and let's take this work around culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. And because of the dynamics that were happening and the sort of increased conversation around racial equity, talked a little bit more about taking the design team and actually scaling that across the school so that everyone was learning from it. So what we saw was just sort of in this moment, the teams that were put together, because they were managing the change collaboratively, they were able to sort of steer the ship in meaningful ways as we were trying to traverse this crisis that has been COVID and everything else that's sort of going on, so that even though it's still a struggle and our educators are balancing a lot, our students are balancing a lot, and our families are balancing a lot, the teams were coming together to say, okay, we're going to figure this out together because we have a strategy around doing that. So I'll stop there for the sake of time.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate that. We have about 6 minutes left, and so I'm going to shift a little bit of my strategy here for how I want to engage this panel as we send the team off to do some work. So sometimes we have this strategy. It's a sort of actually a problem-solving strategy where you pick up on the person, what somebody says, and then you say yes and you build on top of it. And I want to use this strategy as I think about it as the group goes on. So this group is about to enter into the process in which they design a problem or design a pilot project related to that problem of practice that they are starting to design or what their hunch is. And so I would ask you, and I'm going to start out thinking through TLA's framework. I want to start out with thinking about if you have some advice, experts, for these districts as they're thinking about going to do this work. What advice do you have for them? Like, what is, like, if you could give them one thing to think about, what advice would you give to them as they go into this design effort? And I'm going to start out with teacher PD, and I'm going to ask you to weigh in, Sarah, first, and then hand it off to Jason next.
Okay, no problem. It was really a joy for me to hear from the panelists as well and to make connections to the work we're doing. So thank you for that and for advancing my learning as well. So at Teaching Lab, we have a core model of teacher professional learning that's based in research. And so my first recommendation would be to use what we know from research about how teachers learn and grow together. So the first thing is, so we have three aspects of our core model. One is head, one is heart, and one is habits. And so the head part of our model refers to how, sort of similar to the foundation of Malika's framework, we only support teachers in using high quality instructional materials. We agree that it's laying the table or setting the table. I love your analogy, Malika. It's not getting everybody set up and ready to eat at the table, but we do think it's an essential component of the table because teachers do everything. If you've been a teacher, I was a high school science teacher, like they don't need to be writing every single lesson. They need to be engaged in lesson study and collaboration, but curriculum can be incredibly helpful in laying that foundation for teachers. And right now, teaching is even more difficult because teachers are learning how to teach in completely new modalities. Just make it slightly easier for them, put a curriculum in place, do professional learning around the curriculum. That's head. Heart is that we build strong teacher communities. There's actually very interesting research that shows that teacher relationships actually result in outcomes for students. And so invest in the teacher relationships, invest in teacher leadership over professional learning. And then you will also have a sustainable model for professional learning over time. 3, the habits piece refers to how we only lead teachers in cycles of inquiry. There's never any one and done PD. I don't think anybody should do PD on one thing and engage in no follow-up. So you have to embed it in a learning process for teachers where they are learning something new, practicing it together with their peers, then practicing it with students, collecting evidence and artifacts of student work, and then coming back together. You've got to close the loop, bring them back together so they can see if a change has actually resulted in an improvement. The last thing I'll add, and I alluded to this at the beginning of the call, and somebody brought this up in the breakout room, we spend a ton of time supporting students in learning. If we don't think that teachers need time to learn, we're not going to be successful. So there's actually not a shortcut here. I think there are innovative ways to make time for educators, but people need time to learn, period. And they need time to practice. And so create the time, get the resources to invest in the time. We help District 11 in New York do this, leveraging philanthropy. There's creative ways to do it, but they need time to learn. So that's what I'll end on.
Great. Jason, advice.
I don't even know what to add onto that. Thank you, Sarah. But yes, and simplify, simplify, simplify is what I'll kind of do my yes and around. There are many teachers right now, especially those who are in hybrid classrooms, that are really thinking that they have to do double teaching, literally creating separate lesson plans for students who are at home and the ones who are in school, creating 2 different activities, creating basically doing 2 times the work. When I say simplify, part of what we've learned from our blended practices is that teachers who are able to be very effective right now are the ones who are realizing it's not double work if you look at it as maybe a station rotation. It's not double work if you look at it as, what if I leverage this flipped learning tactic that I use so I can reduce how much I have to deliver the lesson. It's not double work if you actually maybe create a playlist that allows you to actually distribute whether students are at home or at school, and they're able to have more agency and ownership in their flow of their learning. And so part of when I say simplify is helping teachers reduce how much work they think they have to do by helping them build the skills and what it looks like to actually do blended practices, which play out really well, especially right now for remote, even more for hybrid, and even for in-person classrooms. Because what it really comes down to is you're handing over more of the learning and more of the work to students, like so many have said today. So that's what I will close on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. Sujata, I know you have to hit the road, so yes, and.
Yes, and does it have to only be about professional learning, or can we open it up?
It can be about.
Great. So, I loved the question that was lurking somewhere in the deck about imagine a student's experience 5 years from now, or imagine a classroom 5 years from now. Because I think that we often design for the next 100 yards versus designing for that long haul, because the world is changing very, very rapidly. We all know that. And if we don't kind of try to envision that longer term future that makes a student's experience really strong, where they are able to get credit for what they're doing in their after school job that is helping support their family because other people in their families are currently immunocompromised and can't go out into the workforce to work. If we do not adapt our systems for all kinds of equitable purposes now, then what we're going to have are massive dropout rates in the future because we are solving for just the very immediate problem. And so, and as we're designing for that, I would urge people, like, systems thinking is the most important thing. We all too often in education, like, pick a program, add that on. You know, we're designing for one little piece, one little cog in the machine. But a school is a system that's made up of component parts that lives inside a district, which is a system that has its own complexities and interactions, which is part of a community, which is a system that also has its own complex interactivities. So design with all of that in mind. I wish we had had more time for like conversation. I feel like I've just gotten a taste of everyone's lives. And I really hope to get to know some of you all better. And one little plug, which I'll send to Nate, which hopefully you can share out, but Lynn Moody, the superintendent of Rowan Salisbury, is actually going to be doing a webinar where she is talking about how she brings student voice into her superintendent design process. So hopefully we can share that with people so that you can hear from the actual experts rather than us who just support the experts. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Malika. And
hi. You know, I appreciate what Sujata just said about systems thinking, because it really is about sort of how all of how it's all integrated. I think the one thing that I would sort of hone in on in this conversation today is that, and this was something that somebody from one of the districts said, which is that, I think people want to do the right thing. They just need to understand how. And so any way that we can support educators, support our teams to understand the how, like in really clear ways. I think for us, both sort of axes of, those two frameworks are process oriented, like do this and then this and then this. And there might be different entry points, but there still is a process. I think anytime we can be very clear about sort of like process and how do we do this thing, it supports our educators, but also trusting folks to use their brilliance and their expertise to make meaning of things in their sort of local context. And so, one thing that we really lean on is also in terms of, I mentioned continuous improvement, our continuous improvement cycle. So plan, do, study, act. And it's something that's mirrored across, whether we're talking about our professional development, whether we're talking about teacher coaching, whether it's something like students are doing, plan something, they try it, study it, and then they act on that analysis and see what worked and what didn't. And so just ensuring that there are these like strong processes and structures that you can kind of lean on, because the problems are hard, but if you have a way to start to solve them and that you can sort of trust in that process, kind of like the scientific method, I think that makes it a lot easier for everyone. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Many cents. And Virgil, yes, and you get to sort of carry it home.
Great, thank you. And thank you again, everyone. Gwen, I would say in addition to all of those great ideas, it's a great opportunity to actually, believe it or not, pause and think again about what are our guiding principles and core values that we hold to our heart, right? What are those? And are the pieces that we are designing for today and 5 years down the road still in alignment with those guiding principles and core values? And check those often. There might be opportunities where people say, geez, you have so many things going on. When you do that check, that core value audit, it might be a great opportunity to remove some things that no longer align, right? We heard a lot about coherence. Coherence isn't just about creating an alignment. It's also a good opportunity to clean out. Right. So what are those things? What are those structures? What is that even curricula or tools or resources that we've used in the past that no longer aligns with our desired future? And how do we remove those and transition them out? And last, I'll just say, put this in too, Gwen, model constantly. So we've been talking a lot about our educators and our kids. How do we support our principals, our instructional coaches, all of our support staff in helping them to be better instructional leaders for our educators and for our kids as well? Because right now they're finding themselves in the midst of being managers and taking care of a lot of emergency pieces. So how do we bring them back to being those instructional leaders they all desire to be? Thank you.
Thank you. And thank all of you so much for sharing your time with us, and leaders in districts, thank you for sharing your thinking, your hunches, your early ideas, and asking for input from these teams. I like to say that these are the beginning of conversations. So experts, we may be knocking on your door again to ask you for resources or supports or ideas. And we really thank you for taking time and going over today. I will hand it back to Nate.
Thank you so much, Gwen. Amazing how much we want to get out. We didn't even get to talk around with all of it. I wish we had another few hours, but that would be a lot of time for our districts who don't have that, unfortunately. But thank you so much to all the, as Gwen said, to all the folks who came to join us today. Really appreciate these insights. My mind was blown a few times, without a doubt. I hope it was helpful.